For years, the world believed Princess Charlotte was the quiet royal child who would follow tradition without hesitation. But then out of nowhere she stood before the very family that defines protocol and declared she would never call Camilla queen. This wasn't just defiance. It was a seismic shock that shattered the fragile facade of unity at the heart of the monarchy. The echo of her words still lingers. Charlotte had been seen as the dutiful one, a girl who smiled politely at ceremonies and whispered sweet remarks to her brothers when cameras were watching. She was the image of innocence, untouched by scandal, shielded by her parents from the more brutal storms that had battered the monarchy. And yet, beneath her soft demeanor, a quiet strength had been forming, one that no one saw coming until the moment it exploded into the open. The declaration she made was more than a child's refusal. It was the voice of a generation, piercing the cold, time-worn traditions of the crown. What shook everyone most was not simply what she said, but the weight behind it. In a family where every word is measured, where silence is often more powerful than speech, Charlotte broke centuries of unbroken obedience. Her words stood in stark defiance of the ritual that had carried monarchs for generations. Queen was not just a title, it was the embodiment of power, respect, and submission. To reject it in the presence of Camilla was to pull the veil from a kingdom that thrived on appearances. The room that day turned into a theater of shock. Silence fell instantly, thick and suffocating, as if the walls themselves had frozen to capture the moment. William's expression flickered between shock and disbelief, Catherine's lips tightened, and King Charles's face drained, as if the ghost of Diana had suddenly appeared in front of him. Camilla herself stood frozen, her crown of composure slipping before the gaze of the child who refused to yield. In those seconds, centuries of protocol were ripped apart by a voice so small, yet so loud, that it seemed to echo through the corridors of history. This wasn't a tantrum or a careless remark. It was the collision of innocence and truth, and it struck directly at the heart of a monarchy already fragile, already fractured, already fighting for survival in the eyes of a skeptical nation. What followed was not contained within palace walls. Whispers began instantly, rushed from one mouth to another, before spilling out into the public through the press. Advisors tried to smother it, spinning it as nothing more than a misunderstanding, a childish misstep. But the words had already rooted themselves in the public's imagination. They spread like wildfire across headlines, each one more sensational than the last. Charlotte refuses Camilla's crown. The child who said no. Diana's spirit lives on. The monarchy had always been built on appearances, but Charlotte had pierced through the illusion, and the world was watching with bated breath. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a fracture that no one could ignore. For a family that had weathered divorces, betrayals, and death itself, this moment stood apart because it was pure, unfiltered truth, spoken without agenda. It was rebellion, but it was also honesty. And honesty, in the world of royalty, is the most dangerous act of all. But to understand why Charlotte dared to defy the crown so openly, we must peel back the layers of tension that had been simmering long before her shocking declaration. Charlotte may be young, but she carries a legacy that was written before she was even born. The shadow of Princess Diana, her grandmother she never met, haunts every decision within the royal family. And it is in Diana's memory that Charlotte draws strength, a quiet force shaping her bold refusal to ever recognize Camilla as queen. From the earliest moments of her childhood, Charlotte was not shielded from the story that continues to define the monarchy's scars. In hushed tones, William and Catherine told her about the grandmother whose name still makes crowds weep, the woman who was loved more fiercely than any crown could ever command. They painted a portrait of Diana as more than a princess. She was a mother, a beacon of compassion, and a soul who was crushed beneath the weight of a family that valued silence over truth. Each bedtime story became a thread, weaving Diana's image into Charlotte's young heart. Catherine, in particular, ensured that these stories were more than nostalgia. She transformed them into lessons. Integrity, she told her daughter, was worth more than titles. Dignity mattered more than appearances. In a palace where masks were worn as often as crowns, Catherine whispered reminders of the woman who refused to bend. Charlotte listened, She absorbed not just the words, but the emotion, the tremor in her mother's voice, the lingering pain in her father's eyes whenever Diana's name was spoken. It was through these fragments of memory that Charlotte began to build her own quiet strength. Yet, as she grew, the contrast between this revered figure and the woman now hailed as Queen became impossible to ignore. She saw the ceremonies, the gilded processions, the way Camilla was lifted into the spotlight with a title that, in Charlotte's mind, could never belong to her. Camilla's presence was not simply tolerated, it was celebrated. But Charlotte, even as a child, sensed the unease behind the smiles. Her parents did their best to maintain composure, but children notice what adults try to hide, and Charlotte noticed everything. This awareness created a silent battlefield in her mind. On one side stood Diana's memory untouchable, sacred, larger than life. On the other stood Camilla's crown, new, contested, and worn with unease. To the world, Camilla was legitimized through ceremony. But to Charlotte, the crown represented betrayal, the erasure of a good woman whose spirit refused to die. Every time Camilla was introduced as queen, Charlotte felt the sting of injustice sharpen inside her. It was here that resentment began to grow. Not loud, not visible, but steady. Charlotte began to question why tradition demanded loyalty to someone whose rise had come through scandal and controversy. She questioned why silence was expected when truth screamed so loudly in the shadows of Diana's story. In her youthful heart, the lines became clear. Camilla's crown was not a symbol of majesty, but of everything Diana had been denied. And so, long before the day Charlotte finally spoke, the rebellion had already begun. It was born not from anger, but from the legacy of a woman who embodied kindness and sacrifice. It was nurtured in the quiet lessons of a mother who valued truth over protocol, and it was sharpened each time Charlotte watched Camilla take her place in history with a crown she could never accept. And as Diana's ghost loomed over Charlotte's upbringing, the fractures within the living family only deepened, especially as Camilla's presence grew impossible to ignore. Every crown has a story, and the one placed upon Camilla's head was drenched in controversy. Behind the grandeur of the coronation was a struggle for legitimacy, one that Charlotte silently observed, her young eyes catching tensions most adults ignored. For Charlotte, the crown wasn't a symbol of unity. It was a theft, a betrayal, and a reminder of all that had been lost. Camilla's path to becoming queen consort was no fairy tale. It was a climb through whispers, resistance, and a nation divided in loyalty. To the public, the coronation was framed as destiny fulfilled, the rightful partner standing beside a king. But Charlotte saw it differently. She didn't see a symbol of majesty being crowned. She saw a seat taken at a table that was never truly offered. The air was heavy with grandeur, yet the whispers of doubt were louder than the trumpets. Every camera captured the glitter, but Charlotte, still a child, noticed what others were too conditioned to ignore: the unease in her father's eyes, the tightness in her mother's smile, and the weight of a crown that seemed more stolen than earned. As Camilla's influence deepened in palace life, Charlotte found herself in the middle of rituals she instinctively resisted. At grand ceremonies, she was expected to bow, to curtsy, to acknowledge the crown as supreme. Yet her refusal was subtle, but striking. A missed curtsy here, a fixed stare there, gestures small enough to dismiss, but powerful enough to sting. Every quiet act of resistance planted another seed of defiance in her heart. The formality of the palace demanded she yield, but Charlotte, carrying the memory of a grandmother she never met, could not. William and Catherine, masters of composure in public, betrayed flickers of discomfort during these tense moments. To the outside world, they smiled dutifully, the picture of unity. But Charlotte saw through it. She noticed the way her father's jaw tightened whenever Camilla was addressed as Queen. She felt the way her mother's hand squeezed hers just a little tighter whenever the word was spoken aloud. These signals told Charlotte everything she needed to know. She was not alone in her silent defiance. Camilla, sensing the growing tension, attempted to bridge the gap. There were moments when she leaned toward Charlotte with gestures of warmth, attempts at small talk, or offers of kindness. But each attempt met a cold, immovable wall. Charlotte did not smile back. She did not lean in. She did not accept. And though polite words were spoken, the unspoken truth cut deeper. Camilla could never win her trust. No matter the jewels, the ceremonies, or the polished words, Charlotte rejected her silently, powerfully, and without hesitation. It was in these moments that the true seeds of confrontation were sown. Each coronation rehearsal, each grand ceremony, each forced photograph only widened the distance between them. For Charlotte, the crown Camilla wore was not a triumph. It was a symbol of everything that had been taken from her family, from her grandmother, from the nation itself. And with each passing day, the quiet battle between a child's truth and a monarchy's facade grew sharper, preparing for the inevitable eruption. But the real storm broke not in whispers or private glances. It erupted in public, where Charlotte's words left the monarchy frozen in disbelief. The moment came at a royal gathering, a day meant for ceremony, photographs, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Yet, out of nowhere, Princess Charlotte shattered the script. With her small but defiant voice, she turned to Camilla and declared, "I will never call you queen." Those around her froze, the air thick with disbelief. What should have been a celebration became an unforgettable act of rebellion, replayed endlessly in the minds of all who witnessed it. It had begun like any other carefully staged palace occasion, complete with speeches, formal introductions, and the ever-watchful eye of the press. The halls were filled with dignitaries, family members, and trusted aides, each one assuming the day would pass without incident, another flawless piece of royal theater. Yet beneath the polished surface, tension simmered, unspoken but undeniable. And in the midst of it all stood Charlotte, a child expected to smile and comply, carrying within her the quiet storm that had been building for years. When her words rang out, the silence was instant. It was as though time itself had paused to record the moment. The family froze. The advisors looked horrified. Even seasoned courtiers, accustomed to navigating endless scandals, stood rooted to the ground. The sharpness of Charlotte's voice cut through the room, stripping away the rehearsed lines and revealing raw, uncontainable truth. Her declaration was not shouted. It didn't need to be. It was clear, unflinching, and unforgettable. William and Catherine, seated nearby, could only watch. Shock gripped them in that instant, but beneath the surface lay something deeper, a glimmer of pride. They had raised their daughter to value honesty, and now that honesty was spilling into the open in the most dramatic way possible. Their eyes betrayed conflicting emotions, fear for the storm about to engulf them, yet pride that Charlotte had spoken with the courage of a woman far beyond her years. Camilla, meanwhile, was struck by a humiliation she had never known. The practiced composure she wore so tightly slipped in an instant. Her face drained of color, her smile faltered, and for the first time since her coronation, she looked small, fragile, exposed. In front of family, staff, and the walls of a palace she had fought to command, Camilla was reduced not by an adversary of power or politics, but by a child who spoke what so many silently believed. Charles was caught between fury and despair. His instinct was to defend his wife, to maintain the dignity of the crown, but the weight of Charlotte's words crushed him into silence. For a moment, the king himself looked powerless, staring into the reality that his family's fractures could no longer be concealed. The child he once saw as a symbol of the monarchy's future had just delivered a blow to its very core. Within seconds, whispers began to ripple. Staff exchanged panicked glances, aides leaned toward one another in disbelief, and within the hour, the story had already slipped through the palace walls. Rumors grew legs, running faster than any official statement could hope to contain them. What was said in a private room was now echoing across newsrooms, fueling speculation, debate, and a storm of headlines waiting to be unleashed. Charlotte's words did not merely disrupt a gathering, they exposed the monarchy's deepest vulnerability. It was no longer about one child or one crown, it was about truth breaking through centuries of silence. Yet the aftermath was even more explosive than the words themselves, as whispers turned into front-page scandals. The palace walls are built to contain scandal, but Charlotte's rebellion was too powerful to contain. Advisors scrambled, aides argued, and senior royals locked themselves in private meetings. How could a child expose the cracks they worked so hard to plaster over? The monarchy itself seemed fragile, trembling under the weight of a single truth. If even Charlotte refused Camilla's crown, what hope did Camilla have of the nation's acceptance? Behind closed doors, the corridors of power became a battlefield. Advisors rushed to William and Catherine, urging them to take swift control of the situation. The child must be silenced, they said. Charlotte had to be disciplined publicly, or at least forced to apologize in private. They spoke of order, tradition, and duty, as though the entire stability of the monarchy rested on the shoulders of an 8-year-old girl. To them, Charlotte's defiance was not a personal statement, it was a dangerous fracture that could topple everything. Camilla, stung by humiliation and desperate to salvage her dignity, demanded nothing less than a formal apology. To her, anything less would leave her crown in tatters. She insisted that Charlotte's words had to be corrected publicly, a child's honesty rewritten into submission. Yet, for all her demands, she faced an immovable wall, William. Though shaken by the chaos, he refused to break his daughter's spirit. William stood firm, declaring that Charlotte's words came from her own heart and would not be taken back. In that moment, he chose truth over appearances, his daughter over the fragile crown. His father and stepmother tried so hard to defend. King Charles, however, was not so forgiving. Fury burned within him at the thought that his wife's legitimacy could be undermined by his granddaughter. To Charles, this was not simply a child's outburst, it was a challenge to Camilla's right to sit beside him. His anger thundered through the halls as he demanded unity, loyalty, and discipline. But the more he pressed, the more fractured the family became, each side retreating into silence rather than offering resolution. What the palace could not contain, the press devoured. Leaks from insiders, whispered conversations carried beyond the walls, and subtle nods from aides ensured the truth spread faster than the official story. Newspapers ran with headlines of rebellion, defiance, and humiliation. Television panels debated the meaning of a child's rejection, while commentators framed it as a reflection of the nation's doubts about Camilla herself. Every attempt at damage control only poured fuel on the fire. And so, the monarchy's image began to crumble. What had once been polished and untouchable now appeared fragile, human, and broken. The people saw not unity, but division. They saw not loyalty, but desperation. And at the center of it all was Charlotte, the child who had spoken a truth so many had long thought but never dared to say aloud. Her words had revealed a monarchy built on fragile illusions, and now those illusions were collapsing under their own weight. But the palace underestimated Charlotte. Her rebellion wasn't a child's whim, it was part of a deeper truth she was determined to reveal. Behind Charlotte stood her mother, the ever-composed Princess Catherine. To the world, Catherine remained silent, graceful, and untouchable. But behind closed doors, she was Charlotte's shield, whispering the same courage Diana once embodied. It was Catherine who refused to silence her daughter, Catherine who understood the pain of pretending, and Catherine who knew that Charlotte's words could ignite a reckoning the monarchy had long avoided. For years, Catherine had been the quiet strength of the royal family, admired for her poise but underestimated for her resolve. In the face of constant scrutiny, she had learned to endure with elegance. Yet when it came to her children, she drew upon a deeper well of determination. With Charlotte, she saw more than a daughter. She saw an echo of Diana's spirit, a fearless honesty that could not be suppressed by ceremony or crown. The similarities were unmistakable. The courage to speak when silence was demanded, the refusal to bow to hypocrisy, and the unshakable belief that truth mattered more than appearances. In the days following Charlotte's defiant outburst, whispers swirled not only about the child but also about her mother. Some suggested Catherine had planted the seed, encouraging Charlotte to say what many within the palace dared not. Others believed Catherine's quiet strength had emboldened her daughter, without a single word needing to be spoken. Whatever the truth, Catherine remained unflinching. refusing to condemn her daughter's rebellion, even as advisors demanded she bring the girl back into line. She stood firm, knowing that to silence Charlotte would be to deny her the very values she herself had taught. William, however, was torn. He bore the weight of both fatherhood and duty, pulled between the palace's demands and his daughter's honesty. His instinct was to protect Charlotte, yet the fury of Charles and the humiliation of Camilla pressed heavily on him. In moments of doubt, it was Catherine who steadied him, reminding him that history would not remember compliance, but courage. She reminded him of Diana, of the price of silence, and of the cost of bending to a system that devoured those who dared to be human. In private, Catherine's role as mother came to the forefront. She knelt before Charlotte, taking her hands in her own, and reassured her that speaking the truth was never a mistake. She told her daughter that bravery often brings isolation, that truth is rarely welcomed in halls built on illusion, but that courage defines character. In those quiet moments, Catherine gave Charlotte the strength to withstand the storm raging around her, ensuring that the fire of defiance would not be extinguished by pressure or fear. Beyond the palace gates, the world speculated endlessly. Commentators debated Catherine's influence, with some portraying her as the architect of Charlotte's boldness. Others painted her as a silent revolutionary, a mother who, like Diana before her, would not allow her children to be consumed by royal machinery. Whether through whispers or headlines, Catherine was drawn into the storm, no longer the passive figure the monarchy wanted her to be, but an undeniable force standing behind her daughter's defiance. And while Catherine's support gave Charlotte strength, it only deepened the fury in Camilla's heart, leading to confrontations no one imagined. Camilla was not a woman to be humiliated lightly. Behind her polished smile was a storm of anger, and she was determined to strike back. Whether through whispers to the press, icy words at the palace, or secret ultimatums to King Charles, Camilla began a campaign to silence Charlotte once and for all. But in trying to crush the voice of a child, Camilla risked revealing the truth she had worked her entire life to bury. The humiliation of that moment, the defiance of a girl in front of family and aides, was something Camilla could not erase from her mind. For years, she had endured whispers of being the outsider, the intruder, the woman who wore a crown that never truly belonged to her. But this was different. This was a wound inflicted not by tabloids or bitter rivals, but by the granddaughter of the man she called her husband. Every polite bow, every carefully staged photo, every inch of legitimacy she had clawed toward seemed to collapse under the weight of Charlotte's words. And humiliation, in Camilla's world, was the spark of vengeance. Behind closed doors, she confronted Charles with a fury rarely seen. If he was to preserve her dignity as queen, then he had to act. She demanded discipline, a retraction, and above all, control. To her, allowing Charlotte's rebellion to stand unchallenged would be an admission that her crown was fragile, her authority incomplete. Charles, torn between protecting his wife and shielding his granddaughter, found himself cornered. Every ultimatum from Camilla deepened the cracks already running through the monarchy's foundations. But it wasn't only in private where Camilla fought back. Subtly, methodically, she began isolating Charlotte. Invitations to events grew fewer. Her presence beside William and Catherine was curtailed under the guise of shielding her from attention. At grand ceremonies, Charlotte was positioned further away, her voice drowned out by protocol. The Cold War was visible in every glance exchanged between step-grandmother and granddaughter. Behind every smile was frost. Behind every nod was contempt. Soon, the battle extended beyond palace walls. Whispers made their way into the press, stories designed to twist the narrative. Articles surfaced portraying Charlotte as a difficult, spoiled, unruly child, emboldened by parents too weak to correct her. The intention was clear: to turn public opinion against her before her defiance became a symbol too powerful to contain. Yet the attempt backfired spectacularly. Instead of disdain, the public saw a child bullied by an establishment desperate to protect its image. Sympathy grew, and with it, Charlotte's position as the underdog, the truth-teller, the innocent standing against power. The more Camilla tried to silence her, the louder Charlotte's voice seemed to grow in the hearts of the people. The public did not see a spoiled child, they saw Diana's legacy carried forward in a granddaughter unafraid to speak what others dared not. And with each failed strike, Camilla found herself not only fighting Charlotte, but also fighting the tide of public opinion that was slipping further from her grasp. But Camilla's attacks only fueled Charlotte's resolve, until the world was forced to choose sides in a battle no one expected. Charlotte's rebellion didn't stay within palace walls. It spilled into the streets, newspapers, and living rooms across Britain. For the first time, the monarchy wasn't just about protocol. It was about a child standing against a crown. Some called her disrespectful, others hailed her as Diana reborn. But one thing was clear: the monarchy was no longer untouchable. Charlotte had ignited a fire that burned through the nation's very soul. The press wasted no time in seizing the story. Overnight, headlines crowned Charlotte with a title of their own: the People's Princess. It was a phrase that once belonged to Diana, and now, through Charlotte's defiance, it had returned with haunting power. Tabloids splashed her face across front pages, news anchors dissected every word she spoke, and opinion pieces debated whether she had struck the final blow to Camilla's shaky legitimacy. What began as an outburst within a royal hall had become a movement sweeping across the country. Public anger grew louder. Protesters gathered outside palaces and parliament, holding banners demanding a monarchy that honored Diana's line, not Camilla's claim. Their chants carried a message that shook the establishment. The future must belong to those who embodied truth, not manipulation. Across towns and cities, murals of Diana and Charlotte side by side appeared on walls, symbols of purity and defiance against what many now called a crown tainted by betrayal. The monarchy, long accustomed to controlling its narrative, found itself cornered by a child's honesty that resonated more deeply than any speech from a throne. The generational divide became stark. Younger voices, especially those who had grown up idolizing Diana's legacy, rallied behind Charlotte. They saw in her a fearless authenticity that no ceremony could match. Older loyalists, however, clung to tradition, insisting that Charlotte's words had crossed an unforgivable line. To them, monarchy meant respect, and respect meant obedience. This clash between old and young rippled through families, workplaces, and even churches, forcing the nation to confront its own conflicting loyalties. In Parliament, whispers of reform grew louder. Members questioned whether the monarchy, already weakened by scandal and shifting values, could survive such public disunity. Could an institution stand when a child's rebellion exposed its fractures more clearly than any political speech? The debates were no longer about budget or ceremony. They were about survival. And at the heart of every conversation was Charlotte's defiance, echoing through the very institutions her family was meant to symbolize. Internationally, the story spiraled further. Foreign media framed Britain as a monarchy in crisis, torn apart not by war or politics, but by a granddaughter's refusal to bend to tradition. Across Europe and America, commentators drew parallels between Charlotte and Diana, between Camilla's ambition and the monarchy's decline. The crown that once commanded global respect now looked fragile, its shine dulled by the words of a girl too young to wear it, but old enough to expose its weaknesses. Charlotte's innocence only magnified the contrast. She was no schemer, no politician, no strategist. She was a child, unafraid to speak truth in a palace of silence. Camilla, by comparison, appeared calculated, desperate, her ambition laid bare by the very need to suppress the rebellion. The nation saw the contrast and made its choice. To many, Charlotte's purity outweighed Camilla's crown, and Diana's legacy once again eclipsed the throne. And as the nation argued, Charlotte prepared to deliver one final act that would forever seal her defiance into history. Charlotte's words may have begun as the voice of a child, but they became the anthem of a nation. Her refusal to call Camilla queen wasn't just about titles, it was about truth, justice, and the unbreakable bond with Diana's memory. And as the cameras captured her unshaken gaze, one truth became undeniable. Charlotte wasn't just shaping her own destiny, she was reshaping the monarchy itself. From that moment forward, her defiance was no longer seen as a child's outburst. It was a turning point, a fracture in the monarchy that could not be sealed. The crown, once untouchable, now looked fragile in the face of a child's honesty. For centuries, obedience had been the currency of survival within the royal family. But Charlotte had shown that courage raw, unfiltered, and unafraid could hold more power than any crown or scepter. She was not just rejecting a title, she was rewriting the rules. The symbolic weight of her words tied her directly to Diana's unfinished legacy. Diana, too, had dared to confront a system that crushed individuality in favor of protocol. Her voice, though silenced tragically, had left behind echoes of change. And now Charlotte, though separated by time, carried that same flame. To many, it was as if Diana's battle was being fought again, this time not by a woman cornered by duty, but by a child, fearless enough to speak what millions felt, but dared not say aloud. The monarchy itself was forced into a reckoning. No longer could it ignore the truth that the next generation was not willing to accept old illusions. What Charlotte revealed was not just her own strength, but a generational shift that demanded authenticity over performance. The days of silent compliance were ending, replaced by a demand for honesty, even if it came from a child's lips. It was a moment that shook the institution at its very core. Within the family, William's quiet pride was unmistakable. Though torn between duty to the crown and loyalty to his daughter, he could not hide his admiration for Charlotte's courage. He recognized in her the same determination that once defined his mother. His pride was not spoken in grand gestures, but in the silent support that only a father can give, knowing that his daughter's rebellion had changed the monarchy forever. Camilla's crown, however, would never recover. Though the jewels still sparkled and the title remained intact, the rejection had carved a permanent scar. To the public, her reign would always be tainted by that refusal. No matter how many ceremonies she attended or speeches she delivered, there would always be one memory that overshadowed it all. A child standing firm, declaring she would never bow to her. It was a humiliation that no title could erase, and one that would follow her to history's pages. But perhaps the most haunting part of Charlotte's defiance was the foreshadowing it carried. This was not an ending, it was a beginning. She had shown the nation that even within the gilded halls of royalty, truth could break chains. The whispers of her future role as a reformer, as a figure who might one day reshape the monarchy in her own image, grew louder. Her defiance was not just an act of rebellion, it was a promise of transformation. And so, the story of Charlotte's defiance closes for now. But in the corridors of power, her words still echo, promising that the next chapter of the monarchy will be written not by kings or queens, but by the fearless voice of a child. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.